At the end of the 19th century, the American couple Edward and Clara Morrison temporarily moved to their countryside home, seeking a peaceful retreat after a turbulent period. Clara, a delicate and sensitive woman, had recently been in a traumatic car accident. Although the accident wasn't her fault, the other driver was drunk, the passenger in the other vehicle sadly died. This incident deeply shook Clara, who spent weeks in the hospital, where Edward worked as a psychologist, recovering physically while her mental health deteriorated. The tragedy, combined with the internal pressure she felt from not being able to conceive, led Clara into a spiral of depression. Concerned for Clara's mental well-being, Edward suggested she spend some time at their country house, a place where they often vacationed and always found peace. Although he couldn't join her immediately due to commitments with his patients, he promised to come by the weekend. Clara reluctantly agreed, hoping the change of scenery might ease her troubled mind. She left for the country house on a Wednesday, feeling anxious and melancholic, still burdened by the weight of recent weeks. Upon arriving at the country house, Clara was greeted by the familiar tranquility of the place. The house, with its old-fashioned architecture and surrounded by green fields, exuded a sense of calm. Instead of staying in their usual bedroom, Clara chose a smaller room at the front of the house, which had a small square window. The window offered a view of the field and the street where her car was parked. Clara felt an odd attraction to that window, perhaps searching for a new perspective to distract her troubled mind. Arriving at the country house around 4 in the afternoon, Clara felt exhausted from the journey. However, as she entered the room and lay down on the bed, she was immediately captivated by the view through the small window. She realized she had never truly noticed the details of the scenery before and was fascinated by the serenity emanating from the landscape. Clara lay there, watching the slow transition from day to night, lost in thought. She felt a light peace she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense that perhaps here she could find some solace. That night, Clara slept deeply, but woke up abruptly in the middle of the night, feeling a strange sensation of being watched. Confused and frightened, she looked around the room, but saw nothing unusual. However, as she focused on the small window, Clara noticed something peculiar, a whitish mark that looked like vapor, as if someone had breathed against the glass. The mark was slowly fading, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a remnant of her dreams, but the feeling of unease persisted. In the following days, Clara began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. During the day, the house seemed empty and silent, but at night, she felt a disturbing presence. She avoided leaving the room, fearing what she might find in the other rooms. The small window, which initially seemed like a portal to serenity, now terrified her. Clara found herself staring at it, expecting to see something or someone outside. She tried to contact Edward several times, but the weak cell signal left her isolated and even more anxious. The situation worsened when Clara started seeing figures at night, as if someone was outside the house watching her. One night, waking from a restless sleep, Clara saw the image of a bloodied man standing on the other side of the window. His face was pale, and his eyes, filled with sadness and pain, stared directly at her. Clara recognized the man. He was the driver from the other car in the accident. Panicked, she screamed and backed away, but when she dared to look again, he was gone. The window seemed untouched, but Clara knew she had seen something horrifying. After this disturbing vision, Clara locked the bedroom door and refused to leave, feeling completely isolated and terrified. Every noise in the house made her shudder, and the invisible presence seemed to grow more oppressive. Clara began to notice bloodstains appearing mysteriously on the walls and floor of the room, stains that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Her mind, already fragile, began to spiral into a deep abyss of fear and paranoia. Clara wondered if she was losing her sanity, or if she was truly being haunted by vengeful spirits. On one of the scariest nights, Clara woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. Her heart raced as she heard the steps approaching the bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly, but the door didn't open, as it was locked. Clara pulled the covers over her head, trembling with fear. She heard heavy breathing outside, as if someone was leaning against the door, trying to get in. The hours seemed to drag on until the sound faded, but the fear kept her awake until dawn. On a particularly disturbing night, Clara decided to go to the bathroom, feeling uncomfortable and restless. When she opened the bathroom door, she looked into the mirror and, to her horror, saw the reflection of the bloodied man behind her. His head was split open, eyes bulging out of their sockets, and his neck twisted at a grotesque angle. The shock made Clara scream, and she fainted immediately. When she woke up, she was on the bathroom floor, feeling dampness in her clothes. She had urinated in fear. Remembering the horrific vision, Clara vomited on the floor in front of her as tears streamed down her face. Sobs and vomit mixed, creating a scene straight out of a horror movie. Clara's physical and mental state continued to deteriorate after the bathroom incident. Isolated and without communication with the outside world, she began to question if she was really seeing these apparitions or if it was all a product of her tormented mind. Each day, fear consumed her more, and the small window in the room, which initially attracted her, now seemed like a portal to terror. At night, Clara found herself unable to sleep, tormented by unexplained sounds and the feeling of being watched. The isolation and lack of answers left her on the verge of collapse. The tension peaked on Friday night when Clara, desperate for some form of comfort, decided to face her fears and leave the room. However, when she opened the door, she was confronted by a terrifying sight. The hallway was dark and seemed to stretch infinitely, with shadows moving on the walls. Clara felt as if she was being pulled toward the void, as if something or someone was trying to lure her into the darkness. Panicked, she retreated, locking herself back in the room. The terror was palpable, and Clara realized there was no escaping the house or the horrors it contained. On Saturday morning, Edward finally arrived at the country house, anxious to see Clara and worried about her silence in recent days. As he entered the house, he felt a sense of unease and realized something was terribly wrong. He called out for Clara, but there was no response. With his heart racing, he rushed upstairs and found the bedroom door locked. Desperate, he forced the door open and was met with a horrifying sight. Clara lay dead on the floor, her eyes wide open and glazed over, with an expression of pure terror frozen on her face. There were no signs of a struggle or physical violence, but something clearly terrible had happened. In shock, Edward approached Clara's body, trying to process the scene before him. He noticed that the bedroom window was open, an unusual choice for Clara, who always preferred it closed. As he moved closer, he saw something even more unsettling. There were fingerprints on the window glass, but they were on the outside, as if someone or something had tried to enter or exit through it. The prints were fresh, and Edward felt a chill imagining what might have caused them. The atmosphere in the room was oppressive, as if an invisible presence was still there, watching. Devastated by the loss and bewildered by the strange circumstances, Edward began to search the house, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened to Clara. He went through the rooms and hallways, but everything seemed in order, with no signs of a break-in or disturbance. However, the feeling of being watched followed him with every step, an invisible weight that made his heart race. In the kitchen, he found Clara's cell phone on the table, with several unsent messages to him, showing that she had desperately tried to contact him in the past few days. The last message, never sent, simply said, "He's here. Help." With a heavy heart, Edward realized that something beyond his understanding had happened to Clara. The unsent message made it clear that she felt threatened by something or someone. What scared him even more was the possibility that his rational mind couldn't explain the strange events leading to his wife's death. As he tried to piece together the fragments of information, Edward noticed that the air in the house was growing colder, and a thin mist began to form in the room where Clara lay. A sense of despair and helplessness washed over him as he looked at Clara's lifeless body, unsure of what to do. Feeling powerless, Edward decided to call the police, but when he tried to use the house phone, he discovered the line was dead. The cell signal was also weak, making it impossible to contact the outside world. The isolation Clara had experienced now enveloped Edward, who began to feel the same fear his wife must have felt in her last days. Desperate, he ran outside, only to be confronted by the same desolate and empty landscape. The tranquility of the countryside now felt oppressive, and Edward felt trapped by an invisible force. Edward returned to the house, determined to investigate every corner for an explanation. He focused on the bedroom where Clara had spent her last days, paying special attention to the small window that had obsessed her. As he approached, he noticed something he had overlooked before. The window frame was scratched, as if someone had tried to get in or out urgently. The marks appeared fresh, and the intensity of the scratches suggested a desperate struggle. The cold air emanating from the window now seemed more pronounced, and Edward felt an unsettling presence around him, a sense of being closely watched. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Edward decided to inspect the area around the window from outside the house. As he walked around, he noticed something even more disturbing. There were footprints in the damp earth, leading from the window to the nearby woods. The footprints didn't appear to belong to Clara. They were large and heavy, more like those of an adult man. The thought that someone might have been there watching Clara sent a chill through Edward. He followed the footprints for a few meters, but they abruptly disappeared, as if the person had been lifted away or vanished into thin air. As Edward re-entered the house, he began to feel a strange sense of oppression. The place, once a peaceful refuge, now felt suffocating and dark. He noticed the daylight was fading, even though it was still early, and a sinister twilight began to fill the rooms. Edward felt increasingly isolated, and the sensation of being watched intensified. It was as if the house were alive, conspiring against him. Determined to find answers, Edward decided to spend the night in the house, hoping the darkness would reveal some hidden secret. As the night progressed, Edward felt the cold inside the house intensify, and a sense of unease enveloped him. He sat in the living room, trying to stay calm and rationalize the strange events. But as night fell, he began to hear muffled sounds, like distant whispers, coming from all directions. Trying to maintain his composure, Edward followed the sounds to the hallway leading to the room where Clara had been found. The atmosphere was heavy, and he could feel his heart beating faster as the whispers seemed to grow louder, forming indistinct words that sent chills down his spine. Edward, following the whispers, found himself standing before the door of the room where Clara had spent her last moments. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a deep fear of what he might find. As he opened the door, a coldness enveloped him, and he realized the room was almost entirely dark, despite a lamp being on. In the center of the room, he saw a nebulous, indistinct figure, seemingly floating in the air. The figure was vaguely human, but its outlines were undefined, as if it was materializing and dematerializing simultaneously. Edward felt a powerful and malevolent presence emanating from this entity. As Edward watched the nebulous figure, it began to move slowly toward him. The space around him seemed to distort, as if the air was vibrating with a malevolent energy. The figure drew closer, and Edward felt a crushing pressure on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He tried to move, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The figure stopped a few meters from him, and for a brief moment, the outlines became clearer, revealing a face twisted in agony, with eyes locked onto his. It was a vision of pure terror, and Edward realized with growing horror that the face of the entity resembled that of the driver from the accident. The sight of the driver's face, now clearly identifiable, sent a wave of fear through Edward. The nebulous figure began to dissipate, but the sense of oppression and evil lingered. He felt an overwhelming need to leave that room, to escape the crushing weight that seemed to dominate the space. With great effort, Edward managed to move and ran out of the room, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to regain his composure. The house was silent again, but the echo of the whispers and the image of the entity remained in his mind like an indelible mark. Still trembling, Edward decided to step outside to clear his mind. As he stepped out, he felt the cool night air and the light breeze, contrasting sharply with the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. He looked at the country house, which now seemed strange and threatening, completely different from the safe haven he and Clara had known. The faint lights from the windows gave the place a ghostly appearance, and Edward wondered if he was dealing with something supernatural. He remembered the fingerprints outside the bedroom window and decided to take a closer look, searching for any clue that might explain the phenomenon. As Edward approached the bedroom window, he closely examined the fingerprints on the glass. The impressions were clear and defined, as if someone had pressed their hands firmly against the glass. What disturbed him the most, however, was that the marks were indeed on the outside, not inside as he had initially assumed. He wondered who or what could have made those marks, especially on a house that was isolated and not easily accessible. The situation seemed increasingly inexplicable and supernatural. Feeling powerless, Edward returned inside, determined to stay awake and vigilant for the rest of the night. Back inside, Edward settled in the living room, keeping alert and trying to make sense of what was happening. He remembered stories Clara had told him about old rumors that the country house might be haunted stories they had always dismissed as baseless local legends. Despite his training as a psychologist, Edward found himself unable to rationalize the events. He got up and started walking through the house, trying to find a physical source for the phenomena, but each step only heightened his sense of discomfort. The shadows grew denser and more defined, as if they had a life of their own, and the whispers, once distant, now seemed to surround him. The atmosphere inside the house became unbearably tense. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, Edward decided to confront whatever was happening. He returned to the bedroom where Clara had died, convinced that the answers to the bizarre phenomena lay there. As he entered, The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and the room seemed enveloped in a cold, thick mist. In the center of the room, near the bed, the nebulous figure reappeared, this time more defined. The outlines of the figure were clearly human, and Edward could make out facial features twisted in agony. Edward, feeling the weight of fear, tried to stay calm as he faced the figure. He approached slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The figure seemed to be struggling to communicate, its lips moving without making a sound. The pain and despair were evident in its eyes.
Liar. Liar. Liar.
As Edward cautiously drew closer, observing the features distorted by suffering, the figure raised a hand toward him. Hesitating, Edward reached out his own hand. The moment their hands almost touched, a wave of energy surged through him, and he was suddenly immersed in an intense, vivid vision of the car accident. He saw everything with disturbing clarity, the moment of impact, the despair on the driver's face, and something more, a detail he had never known. Edward had initially understood that the other driver was drunk, because a broken whiskey bottle was found inside the car after the accident. However, upon touching the specter, he saw a different scene. The bottle was intact, sealed on the passenger seat next to a contract. It became clear that the man had just closed a business deal and had the bottle to celebrate. The vision then revealed the true cause of the accident. Clara, distracted by her phone, had lost control of the car. Edward was horrified to realize that his wife, not the other driver, had caused the accident. With the revelation of the truth, Edward felt overwhelmed by a wave of conflicting emotions. He looked at the specter with renewed understanding, realizing that the spirit sought justice, or, at the very least, acknowledgement of the truth. The guilt and despair that Clara had felt after the accident, which eventually led to her tragic death, were now understood in a new light. Edward's initial anger and confusion began to give way to a deep sorrow and a sense of responsibility. He recognized that Clara's suffering had been compounded by her inability to reconcile with what had happened. The spirit's presence, previously perceived as malevolent, now seemed to be an expression of unresolved anguish and a call for Edward to face the truth.